Hello, lovely people. I'm now going to have a little bit of a Q&A, a little interview with my friend Bob Marlette. How are you, my friend?
Very good. Thank you, young man.
Well, I have actually been sitting at the back of the room,
Yes, you
observing for the day.
Yeah. You haven't been too critical either. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean...
Occasionally, but you know.
Yeah, but that part, the actual sound of it's always amazing. So, I think you went into exactly the kind of detail I'd want you to.
I hope so.
Because it's always a balance, because people ask us a lot about this. It's the balance between the how and the why. And I think that's something good to talk about to add to this. I think, you know, these days you can go online, you can go to YouTube, and you can type in, how do I EQ a kick drum? Mm-hmm. And about 147,000 videos will come up. It's usually like boost 60 or 70 hertz, cut 250 to 300, boost 2.5 or 7K. You know, it's like there's a standard rock way of doing a kick drum. I talk about it a lot, and it's, yeah, there's like very specific things we can do, especially in rock. Mm-hmm. Like we know like how to get some girth underneath and this, that, and the other. But a lot of the time it's like,
it's a stylistic choice.
Yeah, it's like, why are you doing it more than how are you doing it?
That really is what it comes down to. Like, and I'll make a choice based on the artist and the direction that I think the song ought to take. So guitars, usually we kind of separate it into essentially two different categories of guitars. We have our foundational heavy guitars that are going to be our big sort of fat, you know, outside walls. And then we have our fairy dust guitars. In this particular track, there's not a lot of fairy dust guitars because it's done more with the keyboards on this particular song. But essentially the principle is the same, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So let's just start with our guitars now. So in the chorus, again, we're working on primarily the chorus because it's the biggest aspect of the song, and we want to sort of set our sort of ceiling of the boundary. Now, with guitars, you know, I'm always asked, how did you get that guitar tone, or why did you go for that particular guitar tone? The hardest part sometimes is explaining to people a lot of it's just experience and doing it enough times that you go, you know what? In this chorus, this just simply needs a big, fat, heavy tone that gets us our big peripheral outside fatness that supports the outside of the track. Remember earlier I talked about how I'll bring the drum imaging will generally never go more than like 70 or 80, percent on the outside. So that leaves at 100% on each side the heavy guitars. So there's enough clarity for the shape of everything. So in this instance, I always have the heavies hard right and hard left, because that's their space that they occupy. Let's look at our first guitar track. So there's your basic foundational guitar. One of the tricks that I do on a lot of records is I add this other component that just gives me a lot more width and clarity. This component is that is a Danelectro baritone guitar. And what I do is I'll take the Danelectro, I'll tune it, to whatever the kind of the low note of the voicing of the chorus, like when you're a bum, da da gum, that's probably going to be the most functional low note. That'll be the low, because bum bum bum. because that would be too low to have it tuned that deep. So what I do is I take that Danelectro and I'll add an octave and kind of a fuzz to it to create its own unique stamp, so it has that kind of tone. That's got a little bit of octave on it and some fuzzy distortion. And here's the other side of that. Hear how fuzzy that is? The cool thing about that is when you blend it in with all these more traditional heavy guitar tones, it gives it a little bit more unique stamp. And it's great because those two guitars, the way they add to the other stacks of guitars, they make that poke out really nice. So it just is super big and heavy on the outside. And then we have this other set of guitars playing a slightly different, more energetic part. Stick them all together and all of a sudden you got a massive wide just sounds mega wide and cool. And you combine that with these guys over here, the synth bass, a lot of it also is in the production itself, making sure that it's not too busy, that it has an ability to be simple enough, big enough to poke out without getting too messy so it messes up the rest of the track. So in terms of guitar EQ, that's again such a personal per case basis. What I do a lot of times, here's the tone without any EQ. Here's the funny thing about this. You listen to it without the EQ and you go, wow, that actually maybe sounds a little bit better. The problem is, though, the added frequency and width of that sometimes makes it messier in the track. So what I've done was I've taken and had, if you can see, I've filtered everything below 100 hertz, bye-bye. I've tried to focus the curves of the EQ in a way that it really accentuates a certain aspect of the guitar so it can really speak clearly. See how much more low end there is and more body? But I need to get rid of that because by the time you put 5 other tracks in there, you need some of that to go away so it has a little bit more clarity. Now, the other thing that's really, really important in mixing guitars in particular, again, this is a trick, not so much a trick, but a skill set that I've, got over the years from just doing it on so many records. But it's figuring out how to create as much width as we can. And why do we want width? Because width is what makes that sound so wide and huge and big. So when you listen to it, whether you listen to it on these tiny little speakers here, oh, and that's a little thing, hello? I have a sub in the room but the sub is down here. Maybe later we'll have the camera show some of the little specific things around. I have a pedal that allows me to turn on and off the sub. And then my speaker selection, what I have is these little tiny kind of, they're almost like, computer, boomboxy kind of speakers. Then I have that. Now we go to the babies. It's on these little tiny guys right here. That allows me to really sit here and sort of get the width and because if I can get it to sound like it's actually outside of the speaker throw, then I know that I'm starting to get the width that I want. And then I'll switch it up to the NS10s. If on the NS10s it feels like it's almost too far in the mid-range and the bitiness, you're just about right on an NS10. And then I'll move to the Genelex. The thing with Genelex, the way that I have the curve here, with Genelex, it has a same kind of smiley face of an EQ curve in the speaker itself. So you need the Genelec to be pretty, pretty bitey and a lot of mid too. Whereas the NS10 is frowny face, the Genelec is a smiley face. So it's knowing your speaker and what your speaker is going to give you, so you're aware of that sound. That's really important, is understanding the curve of the speaker so you know what you're listening to. Generally, I work on PMCs. Those are my essentially my four choices that I have as speakers here. And that seems to give me the best blend from a laptop to a giant, high, really audiophile, kind of sound.
Well, here we are in Guitarland. These guitars are buzzy, and they sit in the mix differently than a regular metal mix that I could be known for, because the low end is being taken care of by the bass, by the heavy-handed kick and snare, and all these guys down here, synth tracks and what have you. This is a pretty color I picked for this. So these guitars, one thing that you should notice, they're played pretty tightly, but not like super tight. They still have a lot of life in them, and you can see they're not actually really edited. They're just kind of calmed together. The stuff has to have life. The stuff's got to breathe a little bit. If I wanted it to sound completely like a machine, then I would maybe go in and chop the heck out of it. But I'm not a big fan of that. What I really want you to take away from this is that I like one track for a guitar sound. I like mixing them together. I like committing my guitar sound to the proverbial tape. Even if I use 3 microphones, I bus them together. Oftentimes I EQ that bus before it goes in. But basically it comes down to one finger, one track, one sound, one performance, one fader per sound. So I don't have to constantly rebalance, like 4 microphones, maybe if there's one of them's a roomy kind of sound and you want to keep that separate, maybe I'll do that. But I kind of like committing. So now, because I've committed, there isn't much I can do about it. Except there is, which is simply EQ and compression. we made it buzzier to really poke out of the mix and be kind of scratchy and almost annoying in some ways. So a lot of high end, a bell at 5K almost, boosting like almost 10 dB or so, and some lower mids around this about 600, which is really not that far away from the toms and the bass that we sucked out. I don't know if you remember, but this is not unlike the frequency that we sucked out of our kick, actually. This fella right here. You see that? 500, 600 with a relatively wide Q. So now we kind of see how this interacts. This frequency from the guitar that we wanted to warm up a little bit would have not clashed. It probably got along pretty well with this one here from this kick, but they would have built up. And so we want to keep the whole song in mind, and we want to hear the guitar, and we want to hear the kick, and it has to sound balanced, and we don't have like a muddy, mucky area, so we suck some stuff out of places that doesn't need it to accommodate other ones. And that guitar kick thing is a pretty good example right there. Most of these guitars, you know, have a very similar approach in things because, you know, we're looking for this buzziness. So, you know, we got a little reverb on there, and again, this is our, this is the same one that's on the toms. And so now the toms and the guitars sound like they're in the same space, which is kind of nice. It doesn't have to be that way. You could put a different reverb on that guitar if you wanted to. But it's nice. Number one, it saves you resources while mixing, and quite frankly, in the olden days, with consoles and reverb boxes, dedicated reverbs, there weren't that many reverb choices around. And you know, the bigger and more expensive the studios, the more of them you had, obviously. But you had to conserve resources. The same thing with de-essers. You know, a studio might have 4 de-essers, but if you had 6 or 8, 10 tracks of vocals, you had to decide which vocals got the de-essers. You can just magically get new ones into your chains. Same thing with outboard compressors. You know, there's like 2 1176s in the studio. The rest of it is on the SSL or what have you. And so, you know, that's kind of the beauty of mixing in the box. Your resources, your battle of resources are different. You're mainly just worried about the computer crapping out on you with the CPU power, as opposed to not being able to plug in gear that doesn't exist. So these guitars are basically very brittle and bite, and there's a lot of bite in these guitars to you know, give a little bit of this aggression and this and poke through all this other stuff that's going on. They have the same EQ. They sound pretty much the same EQ. They sound a little different. There's a little bit of compression. I find a lot of compression on them, which I'm known to do occasionally on more elite guitar-y kind of sounds. I don't like compressing like heavy rhythm guitars all that much. I don't want to suck the dynamics out of them too much. But this, you know, obviously is this buzzy thing that we're going for. So that's what we do. Let's see what other guitar sounds we have. and how much fun we had with them. And those are the ones we looked at. These are just kind of our... And then our next victims are over here. So here, what I did, these two are actually fairly similar. You can tell by the EQ settings. The main difference is that the part's different, so it sounds a bit different. But this EQ versus this EQ, they're, you know, they probably were even on the same track at some point, but I separated them out for various sections because, number one, I wanted to EQ them a little differently, and I could have just automated that, but I also wanted to have them dry, and I could have automated that as well. Which leads me to our to my next thing, which is levels. You know, see, the levels are a little different because we're going down into the verse. The sonics are a little different. I could have automated all that stuff, but I opt instead, and you see that with the vocals as well, I opt instead to have stuff separated out onto different tracks, so I have more of a static mix rather than you know, constantly moving things up and down. I can just leave these parts that get the same treatment on its own tracks versus those that get this treatment or those that get that treatment. And that keeps me from having to move my faders around so much. It gives me a visual of what sections are what. You know, these are the verse sections of the vocals. All the vocals are red here, and this is another verse, and then these are the ick parts. We'll get to that in a minute, and the chorusy bits and the bridge, and it's kind of laid out visually to help me understand the song in its linear form, and so that it keeps me from having to do a lot of rides. As you can see, there's practically no rides. We're moving the tom up here a little bit to get that heard in what appears to be the bridge, kind of sitting in a static way, which allows you for kind of faster balancing. You know, let's say you change the sound of the verse guitar, you'll have to turn the verse guitar down and go automate that down, which is not a big deal, but it's just a lot quicker not having to do that. Or you know, change the EQ in the chorus guitar, and then it changes them on all of them. You have to go automate the EQ and then put the levels, and you know, it's just a lot faster way of keeping track of things. So the guitars, you know, they do their job, but they're not a big, you know, this is not a riff-oriented song as like you would have in a metal production, like you know, like with Brendan. So, but you know, you can see that it all sits in there right. So these guitars, as bright as they are there, they're competing against, you know, this ick thing. Against that thing, which is a short thing to compete against, which is more of an impacty thing. But you have these oohs, the Kajagoogoo's. Against compete with that. They have this down here, this synth bit here. Now you know why they sound the way they do, because they have to deal with this guy here, which got his own EQ. Also needs some aggression and some of this lower mid, which again ties into the kick thing we were talking about earlier. So this thing. You know, in all fairness, it kind of sounds better without the EQ, but by itself. But it's, you know, sitting there with the guitars and everything else, and it just needed to make some way and get to be basically thinned out a little bit and compressed a bit.
All right, my friend, that was a lot of fun. Did you enjoy it?
Indeed, I did.
Now, you did also produce that track
Yes, I did.
and record it. Did you do it all here?
All here in the wilderness.
In the wilderness.
Yeah.
And of course, the wilderness is the name of the studio.
It is.
The wilderness in the wilderness.
Yeah, you know, it's. I think it's aptly named between you know, what you have to deal with coming here and the state of the music business and the general the wildlife out there.
The wilderness of Silver Lake.
Yeah, pretty much.
Do you find it a challenge moving between organic elements and programmed elements?
No, not at all. I've been doing a lot of hybrid kind of mutant albums. I think that's probably my specialty, if I have
that's
such
great.
a thing. Started out with, you know, the White Zombie record, that Astro Creep record, which is basically that.
Yeah.
Organic and program stuff together, and then, you know, just
Static
down the line,
X track.
Static X,
Yeah.
and just it's always the hybrids and the mutants that make things fun and exciting, you know. They're like the new things, you know, like you cram two things together somehow or another. And
When we did the
make it fun.
Q&A here, somebody asked you specifically about that Static X track. I can't remember which one it was, but they were asking you, I like this because one of the problems I find with hybrid stuff at the moment is people have a drum track and then they edit everything exactly to the grid of the drum track. So suddenly they treat guitars like programmed instruments. So everything's like, and it just loses any kind of feel of humanity. And I think you said on the Static X thing, the opposite happened.
Yeah, that one too. The main one that really was like kind of like a milestone that way was that White Zombie record, where it's actually the drummer's timing, and all programming was adjusted to fit his timing. And the Static X record was a little different. That one was actually recorded on plywood, where Koichi he went and he got piezo mics. And he glued them onto plywood and put the plywood bits on the drums, and then Ken would play the drums like that, and they would record those impulses and convert them into MIDI. It was fixed and cleaned up because I'm sure that there were, you know, some mistriggers and stuff that were happening. But eventually we would, you know, just use kick and snare samples for those MIDI impulses, and then we'd over the drums, but just record the cymbals, basically dampen all the drums and just have them play and record the cymbals. So you have those live cymbals over only samples.
Crazy.
So you get that disco, the machine, you know, disco element, but with the live feel of a drum kit because of the cymbals are washy and not programmed.
Fantastic.
Because they still had those programmed hi-hats and stuff along with that as well. To, you know, that's the first Static record. Static X record was all about, you know, having, you know, claps and these different hi-hats just flying around. You know, it wasn't actually, technically speaking, very program heavy. It was there, and it was a huge element of it. But it showed when they were playing live, because everything that the band played live was being played live in the studio, was played live, with the exception of a few weird little guitar noisy tracks or this and that. There wasn't any double guitars or bass or vocals or anything like that. There's some vocal effects, like vocal throws and weirdnesses that you can't really do live. But basically what it boils down to is when they played live and the tape would stop, you'd still have a killer show. You just were missing those little sparkly elements, but it still sounded like a band, unlike a band that plays to tracks and it stops and everybody, you know, the whole thing disintegrates, you know?
Yeah.
So that was a big difference between Static X and a lot of other bands that do those tape playback things.